Welcome everybody to Lecture 1 on Humans, Technology and Things, or does technology serve you, or do you serve it? We're going to get right into it. First lecture is Humans and Technology, the basics. I wanted to use the first couple of slides to just recap some things from the first unit where we introduced technology and humans. Just to think of our definition of technology we're working with. An artificial means to introduce natural power in order to achieve a specific objective efficiently or at a greater scale. So to do something faster, more effectively, or at a greater scale, more of it, higher volume, in more places, etc. The natural power includes hard forces like energy and materials, soft forces like natural phenomena. Think of wind and inherent properties of nature, water, etc., etc., etc. That definition is nice and general and loose, but it's about taking forces, turning them into things that can make life more efficient or at a greater scale. And there's usually two ways of thinking about it. Instrumentality, so controlling human environments to make them more pleasurable and better to live in, controlling the lighting, the temperature, refrigeration we talked about earlier. And productivity, producing, inventing new things, bringing new things into existence. So you can see a textile factory powered by steam in that photograph there from the late 1800s. So what that allowed people to do was, rather than sewing fabrics by hand, produce them on a mass scale for a mass market. And a lot of the human labor was complemented by technology. Still very difficult work, still very gendered work, although this photograph has men at the front. You'll see in the back there's a lot of women and actually quite a lot of children. So we think of technology as human fabrication to make life more efficient or operate at a greater scale. It's inseparable from human society, and we talked about a human technological system or a socio-technological system, and it's useful to think of that so we don't think of something like technology as not a human thing and it just comes over and humans make use of it. Humans are bound up in it, entangled in it in lots of different ways, and it often escapes human control. That's really what we want to talk about today when we introduce the idea of entanglement.
And technology isn't a Western thing. All societies have had technology, so it's an important point.
That's a really crucial thing to point out.
Associated with, like, again, electricity and stuff like that, where, you know, a tool, you know, using a bone to kill an animal or something, you know,
yes,
is a use of technology.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. Medicines, you know, taking botanicals and turning them into cures, for example, are technologies that have been really crucial to populations and societies to grow. So one point it's really important to make is this idea of unevenness with technology. So even if it seems as if people around the world are all using the same technologies for the same thing, it's really important to point out that technology is experienced in place. It's experienced in context. So you can see the image here. There's a guy using a solar panel to power a series of batteries to charge different electronic devices. So he's actually got quite sophisticated technology, but doesn't have medium level technology that allows for a constant electricity supply via main lines. So he's actually also then using improvised technology of batteries then hooked up to quite an advanced technology of solar panels to do an everyday thing like power a computer. I think he's watching a movie, actually. It looks like a portable DVD player. And that's just one of the many examples of the way in which people improvise their uses of technology, and the way in which high technology, such as a mobile phone, is also used in what are otherwise probably quite low technology environments. And so there's not always a neat progression. And we talked a little bit about the way in which the study of technology and society was about the spatial distribution of modernity. And I think this picture really captures it quite well. The buildings look partially modern, partially quite traditional, but then the technology looks often a little high-tech, a little like mid-tech, but then there's a lot of improvisation to make all of those things go together. And this is a much more common depiction of technology in most of the world than how we imagine it. So we must be careful of linear trajectories of time, right? That technology develops somewhere, Silicon Valley, gets manufactured in Japan or China, and then slowly goes out to the rest of the world in kind of steps or stages down. Doesn't always happen that way. In fact, it rarely happens that way. And the idea of leaders and followers is complicated by the way technology jumps scale and temporality. So, for example, what you also see is a lot of technologies copied or mimicked in cheaper versions in other parts of the world, especially when intellectual property rights are hard to enforce. And so technologies that become essential are also produced and made in other places we may never see in other versions, and etc.
Yeah.
So it's important to think about less of a kind of linear, so like things progressing, to more of them happening in some places initially, but then often simultaneously at different speeds and different ways, if that makes sense. So it's common in many parts of the world, for example, to have a smartphone, but lack a water connection. A laptop, but no reliable streetlights. To have a connection to hundreds of followers on Instagram, but no wet season road connection to the next city, for example. Online trading from a mobile phone in a hospital waiting room, but no doctor to treat the ill sibling sitting on the next seat. And these are all examples that I've taken from sort of my experiences doing fieldwork, where I was often confounded by the existence of high technology. So I too had the assumption that, what? That's so strange. Someone was actually trading Bitcoin sitting next to me in a hospital waiting room, and the hospital had no doctors. There were no coming. They were all actually operating privately and trying to get people to go to private clinics and all kinds of disaster. But this coexistence of high technology and sort of partial or limited big infrastructural technology is very common. So when viewed globally, technology both overcomes and exacerbates inequalities. So it can be really helpful in overcoming inequalities at scale, but it can also exacerbate them at others. And this is something we talked about with consumerism and stuff in the previous unit, that in the one hand it can be a point of differentiation and othering. On the other hand, it actually can overcome certain things, meet certain needs, and meet deep and important needs.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing you said earlier on too was about medicine and stuff like that as a technology is a way we don't often think about it as a technology, and then the unevenness in terms of the doctor example. I mean, one of the things you said earlier in the course as well about technology is the development of it tends to stem out of human desires. And so we tend not to think about like where these things come from and what they're for. So something like the development of medicine, like there's debates about how science and medicine started, and basically it comes from a desire of, to help the sick friend or family member and help them have a life. So this kind of, again, relates to that, both everydayness of the technology we're using, the way that they speak to our desires, in that case for care, in this case to watch a video or whatever. But the scale and temporality thing I think is really important. Like in essence, in a way too, you could argue that what that photo says is kind of jumped levels, rather than there's been they haven't gone through these things. There's kind of a bricolage, picking and choosing between different things going on. So.
That's a great way to always think about it. And so by jumping, we mean things don't necessarily. First, you need sealed roads. Then you need electricity poles. Then you need people using basic computers and landlines, and then mobile phones, and then laptops. No, all those middle bits are not there. And the ubiquity of modern electronic technology means that you often get this scale jumping in ways that existed in the past, but ways that are now so visible and obvious because people can connect beyond where they're at. So I guess our point here is about the experience in place and how important that is. But of course, technology moves between places really rapidly and really quickly, and again, very unevenly. So technology has a long history, arguably as long as human history. If our definition is just that it's human fabrication to try and make things a bit better, to fulfill desires and needs, it has a very long history. The BBC has a podcast series called The History of the World in 100 Objects, and a web resource, and they really help illuminate this. I don't really want to go into too much of the detail of it, and some of it doesn't seem too much to be technology at first glance. It looks more like sort of art and that kind of thing, but often the reason this particular face mask from 3000 BC shows advanced technologies of creating, fabricating, digging up materials and minerals. And if you're really into it, I really suggest you dive into it and have a look at it. It's very neat, very chronological, and there's lots to consider, lots to disagree with. It's a little bit high civilizational in lots of ways, but the more modern ones, it's the BBC. The more modern ones tend to be really, really interesting. Why I think it's interesting is it gives us that sense of chronology, but also makes us think that if there's 100 objects that change the world and most of them are from in the deep past, what's particular or different about now? What's particular or different about the society we're living in now? Is our relationship with technology fundamentally different now to previous eras? And I think that's a legitimate question, and one that we could probably answer hastily, but one I think we should keep in play about whether the technologies that surround us now are things that are fundamentally different, or whether reactions to technologies have always brought about a mixture of curiosity, desire, anxiety, fear.
Like there was fears about the printing press.
Yes.
You know, getting into the wrong hands and all this kind of stuff, just like there is now with Facebook, using our data in the wrong way. I mean, there's
fears about writing, taking away people's capacity to remember, and all these things. And so our fear about, if you spend too long on the screen, you won't know how to talk to someone, has resonances in the past.
Yeah.
But perhaps, and we talked about this in other weeks, the kind of technology we have now seems to short-circuit really fundamentally social and human things, like trust.
Yeah. So one of the aspects that I suppose is that, in terms of what you're going to talk about in a minute, I think, is that technological objects now seem to have much more of their own agency, in a sense, and activity and things going on than, say, a pencil.
Yes.
It can't really track us. It can't really.
Yes.
It can influence what we're doing, but it can't really manipulate us in a particular way that we imagine technology is doing. So there seems to be some kind of new engagement, new effect of these things that is kind of what social scientists are really trying to grapple with at the moment.
Yeah, it's a really great point. So I'm still in control of this pencil. It's not going to come up and stab me in the eye. But with our technologies we have now, and it probably started with lots of automated things, factory machinery, getting out of our control, weapons development getting out of control, cars getting out of our control. But yeah, even now, because it's such an everyday thing, everything from ordering to communicating, that element I think is really, really crucial.
Yeah.
So I actually do think there's probably something particular about now, but I think it'll take us work to articulate it effectively, and that's a little bit of what we want to do in the course. So, is our relationship with technology fundamentally different to other eras? Socially, philosophically, ethically, and I think they're all really important ways to think about it, and there's probably more. So that's an open question, and one I think we should think about when we consider more and more the way technology impacts person-to-person relationships, intelligence, intimacy, which are seemingly becoming more the domain of machines.
Yeah, the sociological work for the intimacy and social media and phones and stuff is really interesting. And
it is
really worth checking out. Yeah.
It is, yeah. It's really fascinating because you would think that was something that was always outside the boundaries of technology and only the reserve of human-to-human relationships. But it's now, if not produced through technology, at least mediated through in ways that were unimaginable.
And it's producing new forms of relating to each other, yeah.
And so much so that old forms seem bizarre.
Yeah, naff.
Imagine going up to a stranger and saying hello. How weird. So, should we be afraid? And I think one of the common themes, especially in the weeks when we talk a bit more about artificial intelligence and machines, is there is a fear.
And the infrastructure stuff that we look at as well. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There is certainly a palpable fear, and it's not just generational about technology. And so you probably heard this term technophobia. It's used commonly in media and sort of social commentary, and also in academic work. And it's simply the fear of new technologies. Has a long history in human societies. However, what most research shows is eventually that fear reduces. I'm never going to use a smartphone, and now I use it all the time. I'm afraid of ever getting in a moving vehicle. Now I go in them all the time. As I've talked to you all about my strange phobia about flying into planes, now I go into them and I don't really think about it. And so, of course, people begin to accept these things more and more and more and more. And I think that becomes important when we talk about the everyday element of it, for example.
Yeah, the fear thing's interesting in terms of different technologies and the car-plane dichotomy that we've used already in the course. I mean, I don't have any fear getting into a plane. I don't think about crashing too much. You do every now and then. I think everyone probably does. Cars are a different thing, though. I don't have any fear of being in a car when I'm driving, and I'm a terrible passenger, though. Yes. So that says a bit about me. You know what I mean?
I'm the same.
It says that I probably want to be in control. So again, our fears here are they're social, but they're also relating to our own socialisation, who we are, our personalities, our orientation towards things.
Like, I don't really fear identity theft online, but it could probably happen to me really easily, right?
Yeah.
But I don't fear it, but probably should, because I feel like I'm in control of what I do.
And now you're broadcasting this on YouTube, you're probably leaving yourself open
to it.
Yeah.
I'm going to change all my passwords as soon as we get out of this. So, but the important question is whether acceptance is inevitable. And there's lots of interesting technologies that have never really gained widespread acceptance. For example, nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, while they're accepted to a certain extent, there's always a challenge and always a debate to them. They're never neutral. They're never just, oh, okay, that's how it's got to be. And there's lots of other areas of that. That I think always have a deep ethical consideration and never truly cross over into to widespread acceptance, whereas there's other technologies that do in relatively short periods of time. So the question really is, does it depend on the technology in question or the society in question or both? Like most of these questions, it's probably a bit of both. What would you say? Yeah,
definitely both. And I think when we're talking about the society stuff here, we can think about inequalities. Again, we've been talking about medicine a little bit, and you think about how so-called women's problems in medicine have largely been sidelined. Why? Because it's been dominated by men. So, the development of technologies and knowledge in something like medicine and science is fundamentally biased by who dominates those spaces. So, these things play out in all the kind of development of technologies and knowledge that we're talking about throughout the course. So, when we say it's dependent upon society, they're the kind of developments and inequalities that we're talking about that happen. That we largely don't question how knowledge is produced or things are produced.
We think
there's always
inevitability to it.
Progress and doing our good, but there's these almost always inevitable social inequalities within them. We'll definitely see this in the week we do on artificial intelligence, the way that they're kind of essentially racist.
And we also, I think, fetishize the inventor, the innovator, the entrepreneur in contemporary society, especially because of the hold of the technology industry on us. But we never kind of reduce the context of that creation to its kind of social environment. So I think it's a really, really interesting and important question, and I think what Steve really gets to the heart of here is it's never neutral, right? It's never just an inevitable progress of human thinking. So Cal Newport, who's a professor of computer science at Georgetown, I only mention that here because he's not coming from a sort of social science background, but from a computer science background, was a really, really strong advocate of the idea that our relationship to digital devices is broken. Now, you hear that a lot. It's a very common reactionary comment. But what's interesting is it coming from Newport because he's a really strong advocator of the internet and an early booster of the internet and how essential it would be to everyday life. So he's kind of very reflective in his writing, and I put a short piece he's written there, which is less informative than some of his academic work. But he began to really think, well, am I a technophobe? And he began to really try and explore this idea of, have I become a technophobe? Is it because I'm getting older? Is it because I'm no longer in control of this technology that I once could master? And it leads into this whole kind of history of technophobia, which I think is really fascinating. He argues that contemporary technophobia, particularly around digital devices, differs from past technophobia directed at, say, the electricity or the car, because phobia was once widespread and came from people with a limited understanding of technology. So you feared the car because you didn't know how it worked. You feared electricity because it seemed magical and outside of human control. Where his argument is that actually our opposition to connected devices and digital network devices has come when more and more people are using them more and more and more, and they're more widespread. So it goes a bit like this. When not many people had cars, people were afraid of them. Then lots of people got cars, the fear was reduced. His argument about digital technology is when not many people had it, there was less fear. Now everyone has it, and it's taking up all of our time and mediating our relationships. That's where the fear is coming from. It's an interesting argument. I'm not sure I agree entirely, but I think his point is that contemporary technophobia comes after widespread adoption and from insiders, not just from people on the outside, and in fact kind of rarely from people on the outside. So why I raise that is that he sees a social shift into the place of technology within anxiety. It's our use of it that's generating our anxiety, not our sort of fear of it as coming into our lives. It's the place it's taken up in our lives, which I think is interesting. I encourage you to check out that article from Wired that he's done. And if you want to follow up his book, he's written quite a polemic book about why we shouldn't use email, which I'm kind of in favour of.
Yes.
His other points, you've got to use something, so yeah, it kind of falls down. But yeah. Is there anything you want to add to this phobia?
No, I think that all makes sense at this point. I mean, I think the argument that Newport's talking about there seems to me to have echoes of some kind of maybe a reflexive understanding of the panopticon that we may be living in with this stuff as well, that it influences the anxious use of them. So
And that might suggest, as you pointed out earlier, that maybe there is something different about now. There is something different about that kind of technology, and we can see it in our anxieties towards it.
because it feels like more of an exchange, even though, again, something like the pen or pencil's influencing our agency in various ways. It feels like that there's something more of an exchange going on with these technologies than there is with the kind of those material things. So I think that's something to think about through the course.
Yeah, excellent.
Okay,